Welcome back to the deep dive. We are so glad to have you with us. Today we are opening up a file that, honestly, it feels less like reading a biography and more like opening a very old, very heavy jewelry box.
Okay, I like it.
You know the kind I mean. You expect to find, I don't know, a lot of costume jewelry, maybe some tangled chains, big flashy things. But instead, you find these very small, very sharp, very precise diamonds.
That is a surprisingly poetic metaphor to start us off. I have to say, a very accurate one.
I try my best. But seriously, we are talking about a figure today who is, well, she's a massive paradox. She is a giant of world literature, a Nobel Prize winner, and yet, if you look at the sheer volume of her work, it's tiny.
It really is.
We're talking about fewer than 350 poems published in her entire lifetime.
It's a remarkably small output for someone of her stature. I mean, if you do the math on her career, which spanned over 6 decades, that averages out to, what, roughly 5 or 6 poems a year? It's nothing.
Right. I mean, I know songwriters who write 350 songs in a bad year. I know people on social media who tweet 350 times a week. But today, we are diving into the life and mind of Wisława Szymborska.
And that's pronounced Wisława Szymborska.
Thank you. I was going to get there.
Yeah.
Wisława Szymborska. And here's the thing that hooked me right away, before we even get into the history, the politics, any of it.
Huh.
When people would ask her, Wisława, you're a Nobel laureate. Why so few poems? Why aren't you just churning them out? She had this fantastic, simple answer. She said, I have a trash can in my home.
Which is such a perfect encapsulation of her entire character. It implies standards. It implies that what we see, those 350 or so poems, is only what survived a rigorous, almost brutal process of elimination.
But doesn't that also imply a certain level of, I don't know, anxiety or even paralysis? If you have a trash can that active, aren't you just afraid of silencing yourself before you even start?
Well, that's a valid critique, and for a lot of writers, that kind of perfectionism is paralyzing. But for Szymborska, I don't think it was fear. I really think it was respect.
Respect for what?
Respect for the reader's time, for one, and more importantly, respect for the weight of words themselves. I mean, she lived through an era where words were used to lie, to manipulate, to destroy on a massive scale.
Right, propaganda.
Exactly. So she wasn't going to add to the noise, to the chatter, unless she was absolutely certain that the words were necessary, that they were true.
That distinction between fear and respect, that's crucial. Because we aren't just talking about a perfectionist poet today. We are talking about a woman who lived through the absolute meat grinder of the 20th century in Poland.
And that is the context we cannot ignore. We're looking at a life that spans World War II, the Stalinist era, the Cold War, the Solidarity movement, and then the final transition to democracy. It's the whole story.
And she navigated all of this not with shouting or grand speeches, but with what the Nobel Committee eventually called ironic precision.
I love that phrase. It's so good.
Ironic precision. We're going to unpack that today. And we have to mention the stat because it just blows my mind, especially for anyone out there who thinks, poetry is dead or nobody reads poetry. In Poland, her books, her collections of poetry, sold with numbers that rivaled prominent prose authors. We're talking pop fiction, thrillers. She was a bestseller.
Which she found quite amusing and probably a bit baffling, considering she also wrote a famous poem called Some Like Poetry, where she estimated that statistically only 2 in 1,000 people actually like poetry.
So either her math was wrong or she was the massive exception to the rule.
I think she was the exception. She managed to bridge that gap between, high art and the common reader in a way that very, very few people ever do.
So here's our mission for this deep dive. We want to understand how this incredibly quiet, private person used these tiny fragments of human reality, a beetle, a cat, a grain of sand, to illuminate massive historical and biological forces.
And we have to look at her political arc, which is, let's just say, it's complicated.
Deeply complicated. I mean, it is a journey from being a true believer in socialist realism, literally writing poems for the regime, to becoming a dissident voice. It is not a straight line, and it's not a comfortable story to tell.
No, it isn't.
And then we're going to look at her pop culture footprint, which is surprisingly huge. Jazz albums, rock songs, major motion pictures. She's kind of everywhere.
And because we have to bring it into the modern world, we need to touch upon a controversy that just happened in 2024 involving her voice and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that story is a wild coda to her life.
It brings the whole discussion full circle. It really challenges everything she stood for regarding that trash can and the biological reality of being a human.
Exactly. But let's rewind. Let's go all the way back. Let's go back to the world that created her. Because to understand that trash can, you first have to understand the history she was trying so hard to filter.
To understand Szymborska, you have to understand where she came from. She was born on July 2nd, 1923.
So the Roaring Twenties. But this is Poland, which is, what, just a few years after regaining its independence, after being wiped off the map for over a century?
For 123 years, yeah. So it was a time of immense national optimism, but also incredible fragility. She was born in a place called Przełęcz, which is now part of a town called Kornik in western Poland.
And her start in life wasn't, I mean, it wasn't aristocracy, but it wasn't exactly humble peasantry either, right? It was a very specific social stratum.
That's a great way to put it. Her father, Wincenty Szymborski, was the steward to account.
Count Władysław Zamoyski.
Yes, a very well-known Polish patriot and a charitable patron.
Yeah.
So Szymborska grew up in this environment of, let's call it, managed gentility. Her father managed this huge estate. It was an intellectual household. They valued education. They were somewhat insulated from the harshest realities of the time, but also deeply connected to this old world idea of service and patriotism.
But that world, the whole world of counts and stewards and grand estates was about to just completely vanish.
It was already vanishing. The count died in 1924 when Wisława was just a baby, just 1 year old. The family had to move. First, they went to a city called Toru, and then in 1931, they landed in Kraków.
And Krakow is the key, right? I mean, every biography, every piece of analysis, it emphasizes this.
Kraków is the backdrop. It's the stage for her entire life. She lived and worked there until she died in 2012. You really cannot separate Szymborska from Kraków.
What's so special about it?
Well, it feels very different from, say, Warsaw. Warsaw was almost completely destroyed in the war and then rebuilt. It has this frantic, modern, sometimes chaotic energy. Kraków was physically spared much of that destruction.
So it kept its history.
It retained its medieval architecture, its old university atmosphere, its slow coffeehouse intellectualism. It's a city of thought, of history, of quiet corners, and that's very much her personality.
So she's a teenager in Krakow, living this relatively normal intellectual life. She's reading, she's maybe starting to write a little. And then 1939 hits, September 1st. World War II breaks out, Nazi occupation. She's 16 years old.
A pivotal age. 16 is when you were just forming your worldview, your sense of self. And suddenly, your world is occupied. And one of the very first things the occupiers did was target Polish culture, and specifically, education.
So education just stopped.
Higher education for Poles was forbidden under the occupation. The Nazis wanted a workforce, a population of servants, not an intelligentsia. So secondary schools and universities were just shut down. For a girl like Szymborska, who valued learning above almost anything else, this was a direct attack on her future, on her very being.
So what'd she do? What did any of them do? Did they just stop learning?
No, she went underground.
Yeah.
When we say underground, we don't necessarily mean physically in a bunker, though I'm sure it felt like that sometimes. We mean secret education, clandestine classes.
This is such a wild concept to me. The idea of classes being held in secret, in private apartments, risking arrest, just to learn about literature and history.
Precisely. Imagine walking to a friend's house, hiding your textbooks under your coat, knowing that if a patrol stops and searches you, not only are you in serious trouble, but the teacher hosting the class is in mortal danger.
That must create a bond, a kind of sacredness around the idea of education that we probably can't fully grasp today.
It absolutely does. It shows a commitment to the life of the mind that starts very, very early for her. It wasn't a chore. It was an act of defiance.
But you can't just study when there's a war on. I mean, you need to eat. You need to not get arrested or deported.
Yeah.
And I found this detail about her day job during the war absolutely fascinating.
Yes. From 1943, she worked as a railroad employee.
A railroad employee. I'm just picturing this future Nobel Prize winner walking the tracks or checking tickets.
It was likely clerical work, dealing with schedules, cargo manifest, that sort of thing. But we have to pause on the significance of this. This job wasn't about the paycheck. It was about the paperwork.
You mean the Ausweis, the
Yeah.
official ID card.
Exactly. Having that official job with the railway, which was essential infrastructure for the Germans, was what prevented her from being deported to Germany as a forced laborer.
I really want to dwell on that for a second. Forced labor wasn't just, hard work. This was abduction. This was starvation.
It was slavery. It's that simple. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were rounded up on the streets in what they called a opanka. and shipped to the Reich to work in factories or on farms, often under horrific, deadly conditions.
Yeah.
Many never returned.
So Szymborska sitting in that railroad office stamping papers, that wasn't a career, that was a lifeline. That was her survival strategy.
It really highlights the precarious nature of survival for that generation, the randomness of it all. One different stamp on your ID card, one wrong turn on a street corner, and your life goes in a completely different and likely tragic direction.
And that idea of chance.
Of luck, of randomness in who survives and who doesn't.
Yeah.
That becomes a massive, massive theme in her poetry later on. She knew deep down that her survival wasn't because she was special or chosen. It was because of a railway pass.
And amidst all this fear and railroad paperwork, she starts making art, which seems almost impossible under those conditions.
It's the human instinct, isn't it? She started illustrating. She illustrated an English language textbook, of all things, and she began writing stories and occasional poems. It was a way to maintain an inner world, a private space, when the outer world was collapsing into chaos.
So the war ends, 1945. The Germans retreat, the Soviets arrive. Poland is in ruins, but it's beginning to rebuild. And she goes to university, Jagiellonian University in Krakow, the big one.
She starts out studying Polish literature, which makes sense, but then she switches to sociology. She's trying to figure out how society works, perhaps, trying to understand what on earth just happened to the world.
And this is where we get the public debut, March 1945. The war in Europe isn't even officially over yet.
No, the fighting is still happening in the West. But in Krakow, life is restarting. She publishes her very first poem in a daily newspaper, Zanik Polski. It's called Szukam Sua,
which means looking for words.
It's such a fitting title for a debut, isn't it? Looking for words. The old words, the old language just didn't fit anymore. You couldn't use romantic, flowery language to describe gas chambers and rubble. She was part of a generation that was trying to articulate the post-war reality from scratch.
But the reality for her personally was also one of financial struggle. She actually dropped out of university, right?
She did, in 1948. She quit her studies without getting a degree because of poor financial circumstances. The currency was unstable. The economy was completely wrecked. She just had to work to survive.
It's really humbling to realize that a future Nobel laureate was a college dropout because she couldn't afford the tuition or the living costs.
It grounds her. She was never someone who lived in an ivory tower. She was always working. She worked as a secretary for an educational magazine. She did illustrations to make ends meet. And in 1948, she also got married.
To Adam Woodek, another poet.
A poet, and a pretty prominent figure in the literary circles of Krakow at the time. They were young, they were idealistic. They divorced fairly quickly in 1954, but, and this is very Szymborska, they remained close friends until he died in 1986. No big drama, no public feuds, just a quiet shift in the relationship.
Okay, so she's writing, she's working, she's married. She tries to publish her first book, her first collection of poems in 1949, and here's where we hit the first major wall. The manuscript is rejected.
Censorship.
The state censors deemed that it did not meet socialist requirements.
And this brings us to the most difficult and probably the most important part of her story. To understand why she became the poet she was, the poet of doubt and irony, we have to look at the poet she tried to be in the beginning.
This is the political arc.
Yeah.
And it's so tricky because looking back from today, we think of her as this beacon of wisdom and skepticism. But in the late 40s and early 50s, she wasn't fighting the system at all.
No.
She was, to put it bluntly, part of the machinery.
She was. And we need to be very careful here not to judge this with 21st century hindsight. Early in her career, Szymborska adhered to the official ideology of the People's Republic of Poland. She was a member of the ruling Polish United Workers' Party.
The big question is why? I mean, she was brilliant. Couldn't she see that it was a totalitarian setup?
We have to remember the context of 1945. The old world, capitalism, nationalism, the aristocracy, the church, all that had just resulted in the deadliest war in human history. Poland was a graveyard. For many young, idealistic intellectuals at that time, communism didn't look like tyranny.
What did it look like?
It looked like the only rational path to rebuilding. It promised equality, it promised rapid industrialization, it promised education for all, and most of all, it promised that never again would fascism rise. It was very powerful intellectual seduction.
So she was swept up in that.
She, like many others, wanted to believe in a better future. And the price of that future, the price of being a published author in that system, was adhering to the doctrine of socialist realism.
So let's talk about what that work actually looked like. Her debut collection, which finally did come out in 1952 after she adjusted it to please the censors, was called Dlatego u Jimmy. That is what we were living for.
And it contained poems that are, well, they're jarring to read today. There were poems praising Lenin. There was a very famous one called Mutishuyu Budishe Nowo Huta, to the youth building Nowo Huta.
And Nowo Huta is that massive, gray, socialist industrial town they built right next to Krakow.
Exactly. It was designed to be the model Stalinist city, built to counterbalance the reactionary intellectualism of old Krakow. It was all about steel mills, concrete, the power of the proletariat rising, and she wrote poetry celebrating its construction.
It feels like such a betrayal of her later style. Her later style is all about doubt, about not knowing. This early stuff is all about certainty with a capital C. We are building the future, and we know exactly how to do it.
That is the key distinction. Socialist realism demanded certainty. It demanded optimism. It demanded that you view the world not as it is, with all its messiness and contradictions, but as it should be, according to the party line. There was no room for ambiguity.
And then there's the 1953 petition. This is probably the most controversial single act in her entire biography. It's the skeleton in the closet.
It is a difficult historical fact, but we absolutely must face it. In 1953, the Stalinist terror in Poland was at its absolute peak. The authorities launched a fierce, anti-religious campaign, and there was a show trial in Krakow of several Polish priests accused of treason of working for American intelligence. That's sort of complete fabrication.
And these trials were shams.
Complete shams. Total fabrications designed to intimidate the church. But the verdict was death for 3 of them. And the party mobilized the writers' union to publicly support the verdict, to show a united front.
And Szymborska signed a political petition condemning those priests.
She did. She, along with 52 other prominent Krakow intellectuals, signed it.
So this wasn't just, writing a bad poem about a tractor. This was her lending her name, her moral authority, to the state's prosecution and potential execution of innocent people.
Yes. Now, as it happened, the priests were not actually executed. Their sentences were commuted to life in prison. But she didn't know that at the time. She signed it. Was it out of fear? If she didn't sign, would she be next? Was it out of true belief that the church was an enemy of progress? It was likely a toxic mix of immense peer pressure, genuine fear, and a lingering ideological commitment.
It's heavy. It's a real stain on her legacy.
It is. And she knew it. She never tried to erase it from her history, but she spent the rest of her life, in a way, trying to atone for that moment of certainty.
Because that's the pivot point, isn't it? This ideological fervor didn't last.
No. Stalin dies in 1953, the same year as the petition. Then in 1956, Khrushchev gives the secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes. There's a period known as the Thaw, and for true believers like Szymborska, this was a psychological earthquake. They realized they hadn't been building a utopia. They had been supporting a brutal police state.
She woke up.
She became estranged. She later renounced all of that early political work. She called it an illness of youth. But unlike some who just quietly changed their coats and pretended nothing had happened, she really seemed to engage with the question of why she had been so wrong.
And she officially left the Communist Party in 1966. But the drift away from the ideology, that started much earlier.
Much earlier. By 1957, she was already in contact with Jerzy Giedroyc.
We need to explain who he is, because for a Polish listener, that name is like thunder. But for our global listeners, he might not be as well known.
Imagine, if you will, the most prestigious political and literary journal in your country. Now imagine it's illegal, it's published in Paris, and it has to be smuggled back into your country in backpacks and false bottom suitcases. That was Kultura, the journal Giedroyc ran. It was the intellectual lifeline of free Polish thought during the Cold War. It was anti-totalitarian, pro-democracy.
So for her to be befriending him and contributing to Kultura as early as 1957, that is a very risky move.
It's a huge risk. It shows that her mind was already moving toward dissent. She was establishing contact with the other side long before she formally broke with the party.
And then we start to see her taking more public stands. In 1964, there was a protest organized by the communists against independent intellectuals, a letter they wanted to send to the Times in London. The party wanted prominent writers to sign it, to basically say everything is fine here in Poland, there is no censorship.
And she refused.
Yeah.
She actively opposed it, and instead she signed a counter letter, the Letter of the 34, which demanded freedom of speech. That is a bold move in 1964. That is putting a real target on your back.
And by the 1980s, with the rise of the Solidarity movement, she's fully in the opposition camp.
Completely. She was contributing to the underground press, the Samizdat. She wrote for a periodical called Arka under a pseudonym. It is a brilliant, brilliant pseudonym. Stachek was the famous court jester in Polish history. You might know the famous painting of him by Jan Matejko, where he's looking sad and thoughtful while the court party is in the background.
Right. He was the one person allowed to tell the truth to the king.
Usually through humor or irony. So for her to call herself Stachikona, which means daughter of the jester, is just perfect. She's the ironic jester telling the truth to the powerful totalitarian regime.
That fits her perfectly.
It's who she became, and she continued this political engagement into the 90s. Even after the fall of communism, she didn't just retire from public life. When the first non-communist government fell in a vote of no confidence and former communists came back to power, she published a poem in Gazeta Wyborcza supporting that vote of no confidence. She stayed engaged.
So she went from writing poems for Lenin to writing poems that criticized democratically elected governments.
It's a complete journey of conscience. And I think that regret, maybe even the shame over her early years, especially that 1953 petition, is what fueled the incredible precision and the deep skepticism in all of her later work. She knew firsthand how dangerous absolute truths could be. She had been drunk on an absolute truth once, and it left a terrible, lifelong hangover.
Which leads us perfectly into the work itself. Because if socialist realism was about shouting, "I know the way," her mature poetry is all about whispering, "I'm not sure."
Exactly. Let's go back to that trash can philosophy we started with.
Fewer than 350 poems.
It implies that she threw away anything that felt dishonest or bloated or overly sentimental. Anything that sounded even remotely like a slogan.
So what's left? After all that filtering, what characterizes a Szymborska poem?
The Nobel citation really hit the nail on the head. They said her poetry allows the historical and biological context to come to light in fragments of human reality.
Fragments of human reality. That sounds lovely, but what does it actually mean in practice?
It means she doesn't write about war with a capital W. She doesn't write about the nation or history. She writes about a specific moment, a specific object, a single telling detail.
Can we look at the cat? I feel like we have to talk about the cat.
We absolutely have to talk about the cat.
This is one of her most famous concepts from the poem Cat in an Empty Apartment. It was written after the death of her longtime partner, the writer Kornel Filipovich.
It's a poem about grief. Now, think about how most poets write about grief. They write about their own tears, their own emptiness, the silence of the house. It's very human-centric, very internal.
But Szymborska, she writes it from the perspective of the cat.
Yes, the poem starts with the absolutely arresting line. Die, you can't do that to a cat.
Which is just such a gut punch of an opening.
The cat doesn't understand death as an abstract concept. The cat just understands that the routine is broken. The bowls aren't full. The familiar footsteps aren't on the stairs. The hand isn't there to pick it up. The poem describes the cat prowling around the empty apartment, confused, offended. Someone has been here, and then suddenly disappeared, and now is stubbornly absent.
It's just devastating.
It's more devastating than a human crying. Because the cat is innocent, and its confusion perfectly mirrors our own raw, primal confusion in the face of death. We don't really understand it either. By using the biological context, the cat's simple, instinctual need for routine, she illuminates the human reality of loss more powerfully than any direct lamentation could.
That is the unusual point of view she was so famous for, and she did it with everything. She wrote a poem from the perspective of a grain of sand that doesn't care what we call it.
That's from View with a Grain of Sand.
Ah.
She says the window has a beautiful view of the lake, but the lake doesn't know it's a lake. The rock doesn't know it's a rock. They don't know they're beautiful. They just exist. It's this radical objectivity. She strips away all the human ego, all our projections. We think the world revolves around us, but Szymborska gently reminds us that the stone, the cloud, and the beetle really don't care about our politics or our wars.
It's humbling.
It is. And in a strange way, it's liberating.
She also had this deep philosophical obsession with the idea of not knowing.
Yes. In her Nobel lecture, which is a masterpiece, by the way, everyone should read it, she talked about the phrase, "I don't know." She said those three words, "I don't know," are three of the most important and powerful words a human can say.
Why? Why is that so important?
Because fanatics always know. Hitler knew, Stalin knew, terrorists know. They're absolutely certain of their truth. And that certainty is what allows them to do terrible things. Poets, at least poets like her, are the ones who admit they don't know. They are the ones who keep exploring, who keep asking questions. She said inspiration itself is born from a continuous, "I don't know."
Now, she wasn't just sitting around contemplating the void. She had a day job for most of her life. She was an editor.
A very dedicated one. She was on the staff of the weekly magazine Ishi Literaki, which means literary life, from 1953 all the way to 1981. That is a massive chunk of her life, 28 years.
And she ran a book review column there that I find absolutely delightful. It was called Lectury Nadobowiskowe.
Non-required reading. This column is legendary in Poland. Most literary editors, they want to review the serious new novels, the big philosophical treatises. Szymborska, she would review the books that nobody else would touch.
Like what? Give me some examples.
A history of buttons, a guide to bird watching, a handbook on how to repair vacuum cleaners, gardening almanacs, biographies of obscure opera singers.
Why? Was she mocking them? Was it ironic?
No, that is the absolute beauty of it. She loved them. She was endlessly, genuinely curious. She believed that a guide to plumbing tells us just as much about human nature, our need to fix things, our constant struggle against entropy, as a great novel does. She could find poetry and profound insight in the instruction manual for a toaster.
It connects back to that idea of fragments, doesn't it? You can find the entire universe in a button.
Exactly. Many of these essays were later published as books, and they are funny, insightful, and incredibly warm. They show a mind that is interested in everything. Nothing human is alien to her.
She was also a translator, right?
Yes, primarily from French. She translated French Baroque poetry, particularly Agrippa d'Aubigné.
Which is heavy, difficult stuff. Baroque poetry is incredibly complex, structural, rigid.
Very intricate, very formal, which probably honed her own skills and precision. If you can successfully translate Baroque French poetry into Polish, you learn how to weigh every single syllable, every comma.
So for decades, she is this respected, slightly eccentric, very private editor and poet in Kraków. She's well known in Poland, certainly, but she isn't a global superstar. And then 1996 happens.
The big one. The phone call from Stockholm. The Nobel Prize in Literature.
How does she react to that? Because this is a woman who famously cut the cord on her telephone so she wouldn't have to talk to people she didn't know.
Well, for a private person who values her quiet time and her trash can, above all else, it was a catastrophe. She famously called it the Stockholm tragedy. She was joking, but only half joking. It completely disrupted her life. Suddenly, the entire world wanted a piece of her. Journalists were camping out on her doorstep. Her phone, when she finally plugged it back in, never stopped ringing.
She hated the fuss.
But the work suddenly went global.
That is the immense upside of the tragedy. Her work was translated into Arabic, Hebrew, Japanese, Persian, Chinese, but essentially every major European language.
Yeah.
People in Tokyo and Tehran and New York were suddenly reading about that cat in the empty apartment in Kraków.
It's amazing how universal her very specific, very Polish irony turned out to be.
Because at its core, she deals with human nature, not just Polish nature. Loss is loss, love is love, doubt is doubt, no matter what language you speak.
She got other major awards, too. The Goethe Prize in 1991, the Herder Prize in 1995.
And in 2011, near the end of her life, she received the Order of the White Eagle.
That's the biggest one in Poland.
It's the highest state order in the country, a huge honor. And she was made an honorary citizen of Kraków, which probably meant just as much to her. Let's look at the books that got her there. If a listener today wants to pick up Szymborska, what are the key titles they're going to see?
Well, you'd probably skip the early socialist stuff unless you're a scholar. The real Szymborska voice, that voice of ironic precision, begins to emerge in her 1957 collection, Calling Out to Yeti.
Calling Out to Yeti, I just love that title. It feels so futile. You're yelling at a monster that might not even exist.
Exactly. It's a perfect metaphor for her break from the certainty of Stalinism. Then you have Salt in 1962, a great title, basic, essential, stinging. Then People on the Bridge in 1986, many critics consider that her masterpiece.
And then The End and the Beginning in 1993.
Which deals with the aftermath of the Cold War, the feeling of what now. And then View with a Grain of Sand came out around the time of the Nobel in 1996. That's the collection most English speakers start with.
And we shouldn't forget colon-like, the punctuation mark, which was published in 2005.
Yes, colon. Another brilliant title. It implies that something is coming next. It implies the list isn't finished, the thought isn't complete.
And it was voted the best book of 2006 by the readers of Gazeta Wyborcza. So even in her 80s, she isn't just winning Lifetime Achievement Awards, she's winning Best Book of the Year against all comers.
She never lost her touch. She never became an old master who just repeated herself. She stayed fresh, curious, and sharp right to the very end.
Now, here is where it gets really interesting for me, because usually when we talk about Nobel-winning poets, we think of dusty libraries, silence, maybe a very serious reading in a university lecture hall. But Szymborska is, well, she's kind of pop.
She is surprisingly and wonderfully embedded in pop culture.
Let's start with the music. There is a poem called Nothing Twice. Nick Dwyer-Razy.
Nothing happens twice. It's a beautiful philosophical musing on Heraclitus. You can't step in the same river twice. The poem says things like, "No day copies yesterday, no two nights will teach what bliss is in precisely the same kisses."
But it's also a banger. I mean, can I say that? It's a genuine hit song in Poland.
It's a standard. It was first performed by a singer named Uksha Prus way back in 1965 as a kind of jazzy ballad. Then, the legendary Polish rock band think of them like the Polish Rolling Stones or Blondie, did a massive rock version on their 1994 album Ruwa.
A hard rock version of a poem by a future Nobel laureate.
It's aggressive, it's loud, it has a killer guitar riff, and it works perfectly. And then, very recently, in 2022, the artist Sana adapted it. Now, Sana is huge. She is the current pop princess of Poland. She did a whole project called Sana Śpiewa Poezja. Sana sings poetry.
That is like Taylor Swift releasing an album of T.S. Eliot covers.
In terms of popularity and cultural impact, yes. It's a testament to the fact that her lyrics, her poems, have a natural rhythm and a universality that just works as a pop song. They aren't elitist or overly academic.
And then there are the movies.
Yes, her poem, Love at First Sight, has been the engine behind some major films.
Like Turn Left, Turn Right.
Exactly. The famous Asian film starring Takeshi Kaneshiro. The entire plot is based on the central idea of that poem. Two people who live side by side, who pass each other constantly, but who never meet, even though they're destined for each other.
And Krzysztof Kieślowski, the absolute master of cinema.
His final film, the masterpiece Three Colors. Red. He said publicly that it was deeply inspired by Love at First Sight. The whole film is about chance, about misconnections, about the almosts and what-ifs of life, which is the core of that poem.
It's just wild to me that a short poem about two people passing each other on the street can spawn multiple feature films.
It speaks to the incredible visual nature of her writing. She sets a scene, she directs the camera of your mind with just a few precise words.
And we have to mention the jazz connection.
Yes. In her last year, she collaborated with the great trumpeter Tomasz Stacko.
A giant of European jazz.
A true legend. He was so inspired by their collaboration and by her poetry that after she died, he dedicated his next album on the prestigious ECM label to her memory. It was called Wisława, released in 2013.
Jazz feels like the right genre for her. It's improvisational, but within a structure. It's precise, but also a little smoky and mysterious.
I completely agree. It fits her rhythm perfectly.
So she passed away in 2012.
February 1st, 2012, at home in her apartment in Krakow.
Was it peaceful?
Yes, by all accounts it was. She died in her sleep. She had been battling lung cancer. She was a famous lifelong smoker. But she died surrounded by friends and relatives.
And true to form, she was working right up until the end.
She was. She was working on new poetry. She didn't have the strength to arrange the final order of the poems for the collection, but they were published posthumously later that year in a book called Wystarczy.
Which means enough.
Again, enough. What a perfect, powerful final word. It's like she's telling us, okay, that's it. Stop looking for more. This is enough.
And in 2013, the Wisława Szymborska Award was established to honor her legacy. It's now one of the most important literary prizes in Poland. But the story doesn't quite end there, does it? And this is where we have to talk about 2024. Because if Szymborska's entire life was about the human touch, the personal filter, the trash can, and the uncertainty of existence, what happened in 2024 feels like a battle for her soul.
The AI controversy. It's a bizarre final chapter.
Set the scene for us. What exactly happened?
Okay, so in 2024, the president of the Wisława Szymborska Foundation, a man named Mikołaj Różanek, who, by the way, was her personal secretary for many years and has seriously protected her legacy, he signed an agreement with a local radio station, Polski Radio's OAF Radio Krakow.
And what was this agreement for?
To let the station use archival voice recordings of Szymborska to train an artificial intelligence model. They created a synthetic Szymborska, a vocal deepfake.
A deepfake poet. And what do they do with it?
They used it for an interview-like program. They had an AI Szymborska commenting on current events, answering questions that she was never asked in her life.
Oh boy, I can see where this is going. How did that go down?
Not well. It was broadcast on October 29, 2024, and it was swiftly and roundly condemned. Polish audiences hated it. Media producers, other writers, they all hated it. It caused a massive public backlash against the foundation and the radio station.
Why do you think the reaction was so visceral? I mean, we see AI being used everywhere now. Why did this specific instance strike such a raw nerve?
Think about everything we have just discussed for the last hour. Think about the central metaphor of her life, the trash can.
The trash can represents editing. It represents choice, human judgment.
Exactly. Szymborska published 350 poems because she threw away thousands. She filtered, she agonized over every single word. And AI doesn't have a trash can. It doesn't have taste. It doesn't have doubt. It just generates content based on probability patterns.
So to put new words in her mouth
Is a fundamental violation of her silence. She was a woman who carefully, deliberately chose when to speak and when not to speak. To have a robot endlessly generating chatter in her voice is the absolute antithesis of who she was.
And there's the biological context that the Nobel Committee mentioned.
Yes. Her poetry was always grounded in the fragility and the reality of the human body. The cat that needs to eat, the lungs that breathe smoke, the heart that stops beating. And AI has no biological context. It cannot understand death. It can only simulate the language of death. It has no body, no pain, no joy.
It is the ultimate irony.
It is. And not the good kind of irony. Not the Szymborska kind that reveals a deeper truth. This was a shallow irony that obscured it. It treated her unique human voice as a brand asset to be exploited, rather than the authentic expression of a human soul.
It raises such huge, troubling questions about legacy. Just because we can bring her voice back with technology, does that mean we should?
I think the Polish public's answer to that was a resounding no.
And I can't help but think she would have written a brilliant, devastating poem about this.
Oh, absolutely. I can almost hear it. The robot in the empty studio or the algorithm's dream of consciousness.
She would have found it darkly funny, but also terrifying. I think she would have pitied the robot for having all the words but none of the meaning.
I agree.
So, let's bring this deep dive in for a landing. We've looked at the girl from Prowant, the railroad worker stamping ID cards to survive, the socialist realist true believer, the disillusioned dissident, the Nobel winner who hid from the press, and the unlikely pop culture icon.
She was a woman of so many contradictions. A socialist who became a symbol of intellectual freedom, a recluse who became a global celebrity, a writer of very few words who inspired endless conversation and art.
For our listeners, for the learners out there, I think the big takeaway for me is about the power of those fragments. You don't need to write the 1,000-page history of the war to explain the war. Sometimes you just need to describe the cat in the empty apartment.
And the importance of the trash can. In a world of information overload, where we are just bombarded with content AI generated or otherwise, there is immense value in editing, in silence, in waiting until you have the right word, not just any word.
And also just the power of acknowledging that you might have been wrong in the past. Her political journey shows that you can change your mind. You can grow. You can have the courage to say, I was wrong.
Or to say, I don't know. The courage to admit that is what leads to true wisdom.
I want to leave you all with a final thought today. We talked about her poem, Some Like Poetry, where she says maybe 2 in 1,000 people really like poetry. But then we see her selling out bookstores, inspiring rock concerts, and having her poems turned into blockbuster movies.
The data seems to contradict the hypothesis.
It totally does. So here's the question. Are the barriers to art real, or do we just build them up in our heads? Maybe 2 in 1,000 like poetry with a capital P, the kind they force you to memorize and analyze in school. But maybe millions of people like the truth when it's told with irony and precision. Or, to bring it all back to 2024, if an AI can mimic her voice perfectly, does it matter if the soul isn't there? Would Szymborska herself have viewed a robot mimicking her voice as the ultimate chilling, ironic precision? Or the final tragic victory of the biological context being erased forever?
That is a question she has left for us to answer.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you on the next one.